This is Openwork, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Riley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Rapkin, co-founder of Collective.
And today on the podcast, we're doing 2024 predictions. We're recording this at the beginning of the year, and we figured now is as good a time as any to talk about what we see in the year ahead. And we'll each make three predictions. So Asher, you'll get three predictions. I'll make three predictions. We'll discuss those. We should probably come back to this at the end of next year, or maybe when we do our 2025 predictions, and take a look at how we did. But before we get into those, it probably makes sense to start with where we are in the industry now, because obviously that sets the context for where things are going.
Yeah, so we're coming out of, as I think most listeners who are even moderately interested in the industry know, we're coming out of a period of intense bull market that for the last 18 months or so has been cooling significantly. And I'm using the metric of the secondary market here, not the primary market. And I'll caveat this by saying that personally, I don't believe that the financial value of a watch is an accurate measurement of the quality of the watch. But we're not here to talk about that right now. We're here to talk about the industry. And obviously, the industry runs on money. And that means that the value of these objects not only is a metric for customers and end users who collect them, but also a key metric when people consider buying and therefore influences the revenue of these larger companies that manufacture these watches. We're starting to see things level out, which is to say demand is beginning to cool. And even though there are more collectors now than there were prior to the pandemic, for sure, several large percentage have certainly left the community since the bubble has essentially burst. And what that's meant is that the secondary market has cooled and returned to a more rational state. And that, of course, is now also impacting the primary market because secondary values, as I mentioned earlier, definitely have a lot to do with the way a lot of people think about collecting and therefore how they buy. So with FOMO taken off the table, this idea that if I don't buy it right now, I'm never going to have a chance, we're back to more considered purchasing behaviors amongst clients. And, you know, that's definitely not a bad thing, but it does impact the overall industry. So in short, I think we're back to a place of a bit of slower acquisition from a customer standpoint and perhaps more moderate production from a industry standpoint.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that's exactly how I think about it. And you know, the other aspect I would add to that is the liquidity that existed in the watch market. Meaning, if you had a watch and you're interested in getting another, when the market was red hot, it was very easy to do that, right? You could often move out of a watch you had and either recoup most of your money or in some cases, all or more of your money. And it just created a liquidity in the watch market that further helped to move watches. And now I think what's happening is because that liquidity has come out of the market, people think twice before buying a new watch because it may not be as easy to move on from the watches they have or trade it or sell it. And so that just makes everything that much more considered. But I think you're right. If I take a much longer term view of it, there are still many more collectors who are still in the market and still active in the market and still collected and interested about watches and really have become long-term members of the watch community than there were in 2019. And that's a good thing. And if the market is more rational and if the speculators are out of the market, that's, again, a good thing for anyone who's approaching this with the pure intentions of it's a hobby, it's something they love, and it gives them joy. And that's a good thing.
You bring something up that is interesting and is probably worth exploring for 1 minute, which is this idea of like the speculator. You know, the concept of somebody buying a lot of watches to make money off of them isn't necessarily bad for the watch industry. And I know that that's kind of a weird thing to say, but that sold a lot of watches. The problem with that is that when the bottom falls out, there's no home for those watches. It's not so much that like Asher wanted a watch and he couldn't get it because someone was faster on the drop. That's annoying. But now, if all of those watches are flooding the market, the value of that particular reference or the hypothetical value of that brand is diminished, which is a significant problem. So to a certain degree, speculators create market impact in ways that are outside of just the annoyance of not being able to get the thing that you want. And that's certainly something that we're going to be contending with in the coming months.
Yeah, there are a lot of watches, and it's hard to know how many watches dealers are holding on the primary market, so new watches. But if you take a look at day supply on the secondary market, so Watch Charts is a great source for this. The average day supply of a lot of references is as high as it's ever been, and just a simple look at Watch Recon or Chrono 24 will show you as much. If you're looking for a particular watch now pre-owned, you're going to see a lot more examples of it than you have in the past. And well, why don't we segue now, knowing that, to where we think things are going in 2024. And I'll actually start because my first prediction is really very much tied to what we were just talking about, which is to say, I think what we're going to see is a rationalization of supply. And here's what I mean by that. It's no secret that in the past, and certainly this is like before COVID, a lot of the major watch brands in Switzerland produced more watches and put more watches into the retail channel than there was demand for. And I think a great example of this, one that you and I have talked about before, is the Omega Speedmaster. It's sort of a great case study in this. I remember 2017 or so, I bought a Speedmaster on the pre-owned market, a like-new Speedmaster with open papers, for about $3,000. And that was about just over half of what they would go for retail. Now, if you were to buy a Speedmaster, even in the market that we're talking about today, where demand has cooled, a Speedmaster, new Speedmaster, or like new Speedmaster secondary market is going to be around $6,000. Now, of course, we're talking about two different watches, two different reference numbers. We're talking about all sorts of things like price increases and inflation along the way. But that watch now holds more residual value than it did before. And what it shows me is that in this case, Omega is more mindful of the supply of these things that they're putting into the market than they have in the past. And there's a recognition, I think, that they and others are going to want to avoid an oversupply of watches. I think it's taken the watch industry about a year or so to catch on to this idea that the industry is in a period of a slowdown. I think when we met with a lot of brands over the last year, they still hadn't really reckoned with that, and certainly their planning had not reckoned with that. And if you imagine 2024, a lot of brands are planning for 2024 and 2022 when demand was still at all-time highs. So I think what we're going to see now is, yes, there's a cool down in the market, but I think the brands this time are going to be willing to do what needs to be done to rationalize the supply of watches. And I think you're going to see a supply of watches kind of get checked and come into check.
As you were saying that, what I was thinking too is just a reminder of who the clients of the majority of these brands really are. There are obviously direct-to-consumer brands that are out there, and there are certainly boutiques and direct-to-consumer channels these days. But the majority of the watch industry, the retailers are the clients and the buyers of these watches. And when you talk about supply, you have a couple of potential fail points in there, which are interesting, right? It's not just the brands that need to be cognizant of the total supply. It's also, what folks like us, retailers, do when we do our projections to figure out what we think we can rationally sell and therefore what we buy. So sometimes when you talk to a brand, they'll talk about a watch being, quote, sold out. And that just means that it's been sold out to the retailers. Right, yeah. But it's not actually sold out to consumers in the way that a collector would think about it. So to that end, when we think about rationalizing supply, it's all the way through the supply chain, from the product management standpoint all the way down to how many watches are going to be actually produced, all the way through to how many watches will then be purchased, and then before they even make it to the market, and the real demand is determined.
Yeah, and I think this year, we saw and we heard anecdotally from a lot of dealers that they were pushing back on the brands and telling them, whoa, hold on a second. You need to cool it on the watches you're asking me to take. And I think that message is finally sinking in. if you're a brand, you maybe hear that from one or two dealers at first, but you're looking at your numbers and they're still strong. I think now the chorus from the dealers and from the retail channels back to the brands is going to be very clear and consistent, which is we need a rational level of supply coming in, not more than we can take on. And I think this time the brands are going to be willing to do it. And here's why. During the boom of the watch industry, a lot of them saw the benefits of having constrained supply. Now, obviously, they were constrained because of demand. They were constrained because of parts and watchmakers and all sorts of limitations on what they could produce. But they saw the value it has for their brand, for their product, for their pricing power when supply is constrained. And I think now they're going to be willing to make some of the hard choices. And part of this prediction has a bit of a dark side, which is to say, I think they're not only willing to taper production, but I think they're willing to do a few things. Some brands are going to decide that they cannot be in business anymore. They need to consolidate. I think there will be production cuts, which also means there could be layoffs in the watch industry. Things like marketing budgets and things like that could get cut. And those are the reasons generally in the past I think the industry has shied away from cutting supply, because when you cut supply, you need to cut budgets and you need to cut staff. And that's a really hard and a painful and a terrible thing to do. And that's probably part of the and you also have quarterly numbers you need to make. But I think brands are going to be willing to do that now to defend their margins and defend their brands in a way that they weren't willing to do in the past.
Yeah. I mean, the other way to look at that too is also how these brands often make money, which is, again, excluding direct to consumer, is in wholesale, which means that if you want to make more money with less watches, the watches have to cost more, which sort of leads into one of my thoughts around how brands are going to end up diversifying, because you have this interesting push and pull with two polar.
So this is prediction number 2 now.
Correct. This is prediction number two. Which leads into this idea, right? Okay, think about it like this. In the primary market, over the last few years, as supply was constrained, demand and interest increased. In many cases, prices did too, quite significantly. But the secondary market was strong. So it was rising to meet, in many cases, the primary market cost. So, if you look at like a 15500 from AP, for example, or other examples of watches that had a moment in the sun, like the Girard-Perregaux Laureato, great watch. That watch got almost $4,000 more expensive during the pandemic, but the secondary market rose to meet it. Now, as we've returned to a more rational time, Girard-Perregaux is trading at about 50 cents on the dollar against the retail price. Not because the watch isn't a good watch. I want to say that again, because really important to reiterate, financial value of a watch does not correlate to its quality.
Yeah, in the case of the Laureato, that's a watch we both love.
Totally. But I bring that up to say now there's a problem, right? Because now you have a consumer that's looking at a watch on the secondary market for $7,000 that retails for $15,000. And the money that the brand was counting on, which is the wholesale, is going to be very challenging, because now a retailer is going to be not as bullish on bringing those watches in. Because remember, if you're negotiating with a retailer, that's coming out of their percentage of the sale, not the wholesale back to the brand. So the brand is still making their money, but the retailer is actually making less, which disincentivizes them from buying more. So that creates a really tough problem. So, to my prediction, we saw an interesting move with a brand that I would argue is in this position, which is Breitling. Georges Kern has done an incredible job with the brand. Honestly, I was super skeptical, and I'm utterly impressed with what he built with that brand. However, he has also increased the prices of these products quite significantly. I think a stock Navitimer is around $9,100 right now. And if you compare that on the secondary market, those are trading for almost half that, maybe a little bit more. Now, that's a problem. But he's got a really interesting solution, I would say, which is what they've just done with the acquisition of Universal Genève. This is an interesting move because this allows him and Breitling to produce not that many references and not that many examples of each reference at a much higher price point, which creates that constrained inventory, against a demand that has been in the industry and the collector community now for decades since Universal Genève went out of business, and allows them to once again have higher priced product and manage the market in a way that will make sure that the secondary is strong. And we have examples of this in the market already. We saw this with Gerald Genta coming back with the Mickey Jump Hour a couple of months, was it last year, 2 years ago, which was constrained demand, increased price, and super limited distribution, which was a significant benefit to the brand. Now, that's not going to solve a larger problem like all of Breitling's prices are too high, for example, but it will help. And it's one way to be able to approach a financial challenge in the way that some of these brands are probably heading towards without having to cut prices, which is bad news for everybody involved. Collectors, brands, authorized dealers, everybody loses in a sense when brands cut prices. And some are doing that. But it's obviously it's a little bit of a nuclear option. Whereas looking for other ways to make money is possible. So if we were to summarize the prediction, it's that I think we're going to start seeing brands looking for ways to either bring back heritage, acquire other makers, or create essentially sub lines within their own brand that can be sold at a higher cost, lower quantity, and therefore make them more in wholesale, make the market more hungry for them, and increase the defensibility of the retail price by the retailer.
Yeah, I think it's also an interesting carrot for the retailer. So, part of what you're predicting here in the case of Breitling is that UG will be a premium brand relative to Breitling. It'll be at a higher price point and quote better finishing and blah blah blah. Which is an interesting premise, and certainly other brands have that strategy. If they're doing that, it's an interesting approach to give a carrot to their retailers as well, which is to say, if you carry Breitling, if you do well with Breitling, if you're turning the watches, if your customers are happy and satisfied, you have a nice build out, blah, 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 you're going to get an allocation of these pieces, which are higher margin, lower quantity. You can sell at full price and all that sort of stuff. It's an interesting approach. It sort of helps everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. So I think it was, it's a smart move by them. And it goes back to that first, conversation topic that we had about the reality of the industry that we're in right now and how we should all be thinking about this strategically to make sure that everyone continues to do well.
Well, that prediction and that way of thinking about the relationship between the brand and the retailer actually brings me to my second prediction here, which is around what we've seen in the last few years, which is especially with the large brands, but even with some indies, this relentless move to mono-brand retail, in particular company-owned and operated boutiques, or in some cases boutiques that are owned and operated by authorized dealer, but they're mono-brand boutiques. There has been this relentless push towards that, and it's made sense for a few reasons, and it's had some tailwinds. It makes sense because if you're the brand, this allows you to claim the full margin on the watch. It also gives you control over the customer relationship and over the long term, which has value.
And the customer's experience of the brand, too.
That's true. Yeah, and there are some brands that do great with their in-person experience and their mono-brand boutiques. You and I both love any and every IWC boutique we've ever been to. The service is very friendly, very just exceptional. It's a wonderful experience. And it's uniform. You know what you're going to get. Mm-hmm. But I think, so the benefits are, particularly for the brand, are really clear. There are some benefits for customers as well. If you're a hardcore client of a particular brand, then there's a benefit for a direct relationship with the brand and the boutique. But it's been aided by a tailwind. This relentless pursuit of mono-brand retail has been aided by this tailwind we were just talking about, where watch prices had nowhere to go but up. There was more demand than there was supply. It sort of allowed and enabled the brands to get away with moving relentlessly towards mono-brand retail. Given what we talked about as far as the state of the market now, where we're in a much more of a buyer's market than a seller's market, I think we're going to start to see I not see that unwind, but I think we're going to see this come into greater balance where brands are going to recognize that there is value both to mono-brand retail, but also just as much, if not more in preponderance, to multi-brand retail as well. Because the retailers do a few things. First of all, if you're a customer, it just makes way more sense, I think, to have, if you're the average sort of watch buyer, it makes way more sense to have a relationship with a multi-brand retailer because presumably you're going to be interested in a number of watches and brands they carry over time, and you can build a relationship with them based on your purchase of a number of different brands. You don't just have to keep buying one brand to have a relationship and get the kind of treatment you would expect to get as a valuable customer, and you just get more access. I think that's a real benefit. I think there's a benefit, though, and I'm curious for your take on this, for the brands themselves, which is retailers provide them with cash flow and liquidity. Selling watches retail is really tough. Watches at retail are sold one at a time, and that's not easy to do. I mean, we know that's not easy to do. Whereas when you're a brand selling wholesale to a retailer, you can sell multiple watches, dozens of watches at a time. You can even discuss an order that takes place over an entire year. There's an efficiency to that. There's liquidity that comes with that. When you send your watches, you send an invoice along for all of the watches, and you're paid on whatever the terms are, but generally some period after the watches are delivered. And that provides a form of cash flow and financing to the brands, which I think is now more valuable than ever.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, look, I want to preface by saying I think that mono-brand boutiques from a consumer standpoint actually do offer a benefit, right? And that could be whether you go to a Mad Gallery and you have the opportunity to see 4 or 5 horological machines in one place. That's very difficult to see anywhere outside of a private collection. If you go to a retailer, if you're lucky, if there's 2 or 3 pieces. I mean, Max's company makes 120, 130 watches a year. So seeing any number in one place is a remarkable thing for a collector as they get to know a brand. But stepping outside of independence, that's true of mass market brands too. I mean, if you think about A. Lange & Söhne, right, another brand that I really love, even when they had a retail network, there really weren't that many watches available in the box to see because, again, they only make 4,500, 5,000 watches a year spread across 50, 60 doors all around the world. I don't know if they ever had that many, but I'll play fast and loose. That's not that many watches that will ever be in one place at any one time, let alone the watch that you as a collector might be considering buying. So mono-brand boutiques offer a pretty remarkable opportunity. The problem fundamentally, though, is that they operate on this premise that if you want a watch from a brand, you're going to want all the watches from a brand. And that's a really tough proposition, all things considered. And I realize that, like, for certain brands, that might be true.
Yeah, and for some collectors, maybe.
Yeah, sure. I imagine, I know that there are plenty of, like, Patek exclusive customers. And that's all they like. That's all they buy. And going to a Patek salon for them, becoming a customer of a Patek salon may actually be the best decision that they can make. But that's Patek. And there's a lot more to the watch world than Patek. And when a brand removes the retail network, not only do they remove the financial safety net that you referred to earlier, they also are removing an entire world of advocates for their brand. And the thing about a mono-brand boutique is whoever's working there they don't just need to know one brand. They need to know them all. And if they know them all, then they become passionate about that. I'm sure we all have experience of going to a really bad watch store, but I'm sure you've all experienced going into a really great watch store where you literally spend hours and you might even get introduced to something or give something a second look that you hadn't before because of the passion of that person. So they've lost a major marketing channel by not doing that. So I think that's going to be benefit. The other thing is, and this is interesting, and this goes into, I think, if you don't mind, my next prediction.
Well, I think just to clarify my
Sure.
prediction, I'm not saying that mono-brand boutiques go away or should go away or they unwind or some of them close. I don't think so at all. I was more commenting on like this. There's been this relentless pursuit
I see what you
by
mean.
the brands of mono-brand retail, and I think that chills out.
Yeah.
And I think I think the value, maybe put another way, like the value of multi-brand retail becomes much more clear once again to the watch industry. That's kind of my prediction.
Yeah. That makes sense. I'm on board with that. And as I was saying, leads into my next prediction, which is around consolidation and the benefits of that. I know that sounds weird. So
consolidation of what?
Consolidation of retailers.
Got it. Okay.
Right. And this is one thing that we've seen a lot of recently, right? Whether we're talking about, Bucher isn't necessarily consolidation, but they're a massive entity in the watch world. Watches of Switzerland is an example of consolidation. Well, I suppose Bucher is because they bought Tornell, right?
Yeah.
Watches of Switzerland bought several other smaller retailers here in the United States to gain a presence here. And then, of course, the 1916 company, right? Nay Watchbox, nay, what was it? Govberg.
Govberg.
Right,
Yep.
thank you. And then, of course, what was the progenitor of Watchbox? Watch You Seek? Watch You Want.
Oh, my God. Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
Okay,
What you want.
Moving on. But all of these have consolidated into their own entity, right? The 1916 company is made up of Watchbox for pre-owned, Govberg for new, and of course Hyde Park, and also one more I'm forgetting.
Radcliffe.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Radcliffe. And that consolidation, and these are of course multi-brand boutiques to your point, that consolidation I think has caused a lot of anxiety in consumers because to a degree they're like, it was impossible for me to get a sub before. It's going to be even more impossible for me to get a sub now because now I'm being thrown into the pool with everybody, making it a lot harder. I actually think that there's a lot of benefit to what we're seeing on the consolidation side in two ways. One, the larger these companies are, the more it's actually going, I think, to pull away from the monobrand boutique, to your point, because the buying power of these entities is significant for mass market watches. And that the appeal of those large orders against the brand's production is quite significant. And that, I think, is going to mean more watches and more availability across the board around the country. Granted, there will be homogeneity there. Walking into a Bucher is walking into a Bucher, and they can talk as much as they want about how it's a curated selection, but it's a big box retailer. It can be a great experience, but it's still a big box retailer.
So, well, I mean, go ahead, but then I have a question about that.
Totally, which gets to my point, though, which is just as we saw when there was and this is a weird parallel, but a similar consolidation in the music industry in the 1990s, when Universal Music and Sony Music went and really gobbled up the catalogs of a lot of smaller folks, what we saw was a counterculture appear, right? And incredible records coming out that spawned actually a whole range of artists that are huge and successful today. And the benefit there is if you want high-calorie music, it was available from the Universal Music Group. If you want access to mass market watches, you're going to have a lot better access through consolidation more consistently, I would argue, than maybe exists today. But what you're also going to have is an opportunity with independently owned retailers, and I realize I'm biased here, Gabe and I own one, but with independent retailers who have broader and more esoteric watches, because that's not going to be worth the time of those stores, which doesn't mean that they don't have an interest in independence. It just means that mathematically, it's just not going to be worth it to them. If you can sell 5,000 Rolexes, why are you trying to sell 5 independent watches, regardless of price point? And I think that actually is a good thing because it will make access to regular production watches hopefully easier and encourage independence and independent retailers to really lean into what they do best and focus on that. And that, I think, is a net positive.
So, yeah, I think what I was going to ask is if you have these larger retailers focused on fewer brands that are really their bread and butter and are making them money, does that lead to a homogenization of taste and a lack of availability of independent watches? Or how do you see? I get that it creates a world where people who are independent into independent watches can still discover them and get access to them and that sort of stuff. The music analogy is an interesting one, but does it create? I just wonder if that many retailers are focused on mass market brands, and therefore the firepower of their retail locations, their marketing budgets, and all that kind of stuff is really focused on larger brands. If that hurts independent watchmaking.
No, I think it helps it because, first of all, a couple things. One, when we talk about like homogenization of taste, it's kind of an obnoxious thing to say. No offense, because the reality is the reason a lot of these watches sell so well and so in such high quantity is because they're so appealing to so many people, and and as watch collectors and watch lovers, that's kind of boring to us. But to the hundreds of thousands of people who just want a sub, and that's it, it's great. So I don't think that like there's an issue with that kind of thing. Like we're never going to get to a point where the independent market, that's taking intense creative risk will become dominant as like what's on everybody's wrist. And if it did, then it's the indie artist that went pop, right? And there'll always be someone that comes up from behind that's more that offers a completely new and different point of view. So I don't have a problem with there being hundreds of doors for companies that make hundreds of thousands of watches. And I'll go even one further. Their financial success, those large companies, helps to bolster an industry that has the potential, I should say, to create new watchmakers that take further risk.
It's a great point. So that actually, perfect segue. You must have been reading my mind. That leads to my third and final prediction here, which is I think we're actually going to see a retrenchment on risk taking. And here's what I mean by that. In a watch market that went nowhere but up, in a watch market where, as I was saying earlier, like people were spending more freely because there was just much more liquidity in watches. There was less risk to buying something because you could move out of it if you wanted to or you needed to or whatever. I think we're going to see a retrenchment on risk taking, both from the customer and from the watch brands themselves. So in a watch market where I talked about rationalizing supply, I think a lot of the brands are going to look at what sells and refocus on that and take less risk. And the other side of it is I think customers may take less risk themselves. And again, the reason why is if they buy a watch today, it's got to be a much more considered purchase. For all sorts of reasons that we've already discussed. And I think people are going to start to second guess purchasing the zany, wild, out there, high concept, funky, weird watch with interesting colors and materials and things like that. That's been one of my great joys of the last few years is watching risk-taking and creativity rewarded. I think the poster child for that would be like the Christopher Ward Belcanto. Amazing watch. I wonder in a watch market that is retrenching, where brands and consumers are becoming more conservative in how they think about where they're spending their money. I just wonder if we're not going to see a retrenchment on some of that risk taking.
Are you thinking about this in the context of mainstream brands or independents or both?
Thinking about it in the context of both, but I think, one, certainly in the case of mainstream large watch brands. Now, we could argue if the mainstream large watch brands retrench and focus on their core, that could create opportunity outside of the mainstream. That could create more opportunity for independents. That could create more opportunity for micro brands and others to take risks and be rewarded because there may be a pent-up appetite for that they're not serving. But if I were to clarify the prediction, good question, I would say, yeah, it's focused on the traditional mainline large watch brands.
I think you're probably right. Although I would caveat that with that's at the peril of the brand. And I'll explain. Obviously one of our favorite brands, heck, we wouldn't exist as a company without them, frankly, is Zenith. And one of the things that I find remarkable about Zenith, Zenith is a very different company today than it was 10 years ago, right? A brand, I should say, than it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I think it was still kind of a collector's darling, to be honest with you, here in the United States. And the reason that people were buying it was generally like driven by the historical implications of the El Primero, right? Like, I want to go out and I want to buy an El Primero. Like, that was the motivating element of the brand. And some of the more interesting watches that they made in the Defy line kind of languished. They just they didn't sell. At least not anywhere near the way the El Primero did. But interestingly, the way that brand has been managed over the last decade, they really worked hard to not only invest heavily in the watch that requires very low cognitive load to understand and to buy, right? Which is an El Primero, whether it's a Chronomaster Sport or just a classic Mickey Mouse styled El Primero. You don't have to think too hard to understand that watch. And people, I think, were able to buy that. But because those watches are so great and so intrinsic to Zenith as a brand, it begged the question of okay, well, what else you got? And that led to a very methodical, thoughtful, and in many cases, kind of gonzo design or designs, that we saw come out of the Defy line. And now the Defy line is a pretty significant component of Zenith's modern strategy.
Yeah, in the world you're describing 5-10 years ago, Defy was not even on people's radar, or it was sort of an oddity collection.
Totally.
Yeah.
So,
in fact, I think the Pilot's watches were probably after the El Primero, kind of like the second fiddle, and Defy stuff was just viewed as kind of out there and experimental.
Yeah, I mean, I love Defys personally, and I didn't even look at them in 2016, 2015. It took me a while to wrap my head around them. Not that I'm any great sage.
But yeah, you're right. The second they sort of cleaned up the offering around the Chronomaster El Primeros, it just became much more accessible. People got it. They took another look at Zenith, and then when you do, you realize Defy and pretty much everything. I mean, their new Pilot's watches, I think, are also excellent. It just provides an on-ramp to the brand. Yeah.
So going back to the main point, having a strong core gives a brand permission to be more experimental in other lines, which also gives them permission to turn a customer who has one watch into a 2, 3, 4, 5 watch client because of that creativity and risk taking. I understand the corporate mentality of we need to circle the wagons, we need to sell, make what sells, etc. But in any industry, I would argue is a mistake to do that solely.
Oh yeah, and I'm not advocating for that. I'm just predicting that.
Well, I know you're not advocating for it. I'm just
based on what I know about the Swiss watch industry, that's my prediction, and it's not a prediction I make with any joy.
No, but it is I think a reality, and I would also argue, and this is an interesting thing from a consumer standpoint. Consumer behavior is essentially what will drive all of those decisions, or in your example, this prediction would drive this change. So I would say if consumers really want to see risk taking in watchmaking, then consumers need to take risks in watch buying. And that goes back to the whole intro that we had of the metric of a watch isn't and should not be tied to its fundamental value. And while we're talking about the business of this, ironically, a lot of who's in control of this are the buyers. Mm-hmm. People we buy watches for our store based on not only what we love, but within the brands, what we think people will buy.
Well, and that's why this was a two-sided prediction. It's not just about the brands pulling back, but I think truthfully we see this in people buying from us as well. We get a lot more questions like, is this a safe buy? Is this going to hold its value? I mean, I had someone message me the other day about a watch. Thank you for messaging me. But the question was, is this going to go up? And I just simply responded, I don't know. I can't tell. And I think that's a question. Look, there's nothing wrong with that question. You can ask any question you want about a watch, and you can buy a watch for whatever reason you want. But I think it signals to me that consumers themselves and a lot of collectors themselves are becoming more conservative and considered in their approach to buying and buying things that they view as quote unquote safe, whether that's a good or bad thing or otherwise. Why don't we move on to the final prediction? Because this one is a very different prediction from a lot of the other things we've been talking about, which are really dynamics around the industry and the customer. But I really like this one. I think it's an important one, so I want to give it its time.
Cool. Ready for a hot take?
Yes, I am. I had asked you to tell me your prediction, so please.
So over the frame this up fairly and appropriately. I would not be in this job today and owning this company with Gabe without Hodinkee. And what I mean by that is for years and years and years, I read Hodinkee.com every single day as religiously as any other news or interest site that I would consume content from. And Hodinkee is arguably responsible for the entire renaissance of watch media that we have seen over the last 15
They're
years.
probably one of the most, if not the most influential institution or whatever in the watch industry in the last 10 years.
Yeah, I 100%. However, as Hodinkee has evolved, as all of the other watch media that we can think of have evolved, there's this feeling of distrust that has started to come out in the market. And if you spend any time in a comment section on any site, whether it's Revolution or Time and Tide or Fratello or whatever, you'll see it. There's this feeling that whatever is being written feels like it was purchased, whether or not that's true. And frankly, we should have some watch journalists on the show to really get into what it means to be a watch journalist. Because in fairness, I think there's probably a lot of assumptions there on everybody's part about what's actually going on. And I think it's worth exploring. But that doesn't, what's actually happening doesn't necessarily correlate to how people feel, which is true about everything. But as a result, I think what we've also seen now is not just because of the success of Hodinkee, not just the backlash, but also on the flip side, honestly, a little bit of a homogenization of content, and that makes it feel a little bit too predictable. And that has, along with the disaggregation of content, bye Watchville, whatever, has created a situation where I don't think people look to watch media, the traditional watch media, in the same way that they do as they did 5 years ago, 7 years ago for content.
When you're talking about the homogenization of watch content, what do you mean? Like
what I mean
blog
is,
posts with photos and videos of people talking about watches?
Well, I wouldn't say blog posts with photos because that completely disregards the quality of the pros.
Okay.
But what I mean by that is let's take Watches and Wonders coverage, right? All of us know what we can expect from that generally, which is guy in suit next to guy in suit holding watch, talking about why watch is so incredible. Oh my God, we love watch. Go buy watch. Rinse, repeat again. And this is not unique to the watch industry. This is just true of any trade coverage, right? But it is what it is. What we have, and I think that sort of just frankly can get quite dull. And as a result is pushing people away. Now, I don't think watch media and coverage of the watch industry is going to go anywhere. But I do think we're going to start to see a reinvention driven largely by personality and unique point of view. And I'll give you an example. When we were at Watches and Wonders last year, it's a sea of professionals walking around and a sea of media folks that are highly recognizable, walking around with microphones and cameras and the rest, right? You can spot them a mile away. And amidst this sea of recognizable roles walked three guys dressed in janitorial outfits doing gonzo journalism. And of course, I'm talking about the About Effing Time guys. Now, the three people in About Effing Time all have significant credibility in the watch industry. Heck, one of them even founded a traditional media outlet, right? Andrew McCutcheon, Time and Tide. But they decided to approach the coverage of the show by making their own show, essentially, and not following the traditional rules of media. And it was incredibly compelling. Now, they still accomplished what everybody wanted, right? Which is show me the novelties, peel back the curtain, show me the show. But they did it in their own way. That was personality driven. And I think that, to me, suggests that we might be at an inflection point with watch media where it's not enough to just report and know a lot. You have to report, know a lot, and actually have a conceit to your show that's just entertaining and compelling. So it doesn't feel like you're getting the same thing from outlet A that you get from outlet B.
Or a very unique point of view. I think two other guys who do a great job with this, obviously, and have a huge following and have managed to I hope, I think, earn a living or go a long way toward that are the Grey NATO guys.
Oh, yeah.
And Grey NATO is based entirely on the personality of James and Jason. It's really personal. They talk about details of their personal lives, and you listen to that pod, and over time you really feel like you get to know these guys in a personal way. And there's just a authenticity and really a credibility to what they do that's missing in more mainstream watch media. Now, of course, James also writes for Hodinkee. Jason used to write for Hodinkee as well, and that hasn't spared Hodinkee, for instance, from a lot of the ire you're discussing, the toxic comments and the cynicism and that sort of thing. But when you think
Whether
about
that is fairly deserved or not, by the way.
Sure. And I'm not saying it is. I mean, like you, I owe Hodinkee nothing but a debt of gratitude. But, when I think about the Grey NATO, when I think about Effin Time, when I think about Adrian Barker's YouTube channel and others, there's a positivity to those media outlets. They feel different and fresh, yes, but they also feel extremely personal and unvarnished.
You know what? I'm just realizing as we said this, is some of the best content that came out of Hodinkee last year and is arguably a perfect example of this was Danny Milton's Journey Across America. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And that to me was like, that was like, oh, Hodinkee's like, go walk in that direction.
Yeah, they first debuted that series, I think it was with Cole Pennington, and it started in Thailand. And he was really exploring like the passion around Seiko in Thailand in particular. And it almost felt kind of like, Anthony Bourdain, No Reservations kind of thing, where the part of the appeal of that is like, that was the Travel Channel, I guess. But, you're really buying into Anthony Bourdain and his worldview and in the way you did with Cole and his sense of adventure and personal connection to those watches, and with Danny as well.
So I think this, to put a bow on this prediction, I think we might start seeing, I hope we start seeing, and it can come from anywhere. It could still come from a Hodinkee or a Time and Tide or a Revolution or whatever. But I hope we see more of this idea of a show with a specific point of view, hosted by someone with a point of view and a clear conceit, and move away from the stand and repeat, description of watch X by watch brand director Y. Because, and frankly, I think the brands deserve that too. Because ultimately, in order for us to understand and to love these things, we need somebody with passion, enthusiasm, and knowledge to present them to us. And that, I think, is something that there's a blank space for that now.
Yeah. All of this gets us far away from the lowest form of watch marketing that exists, which is essentially regurgitating a press release, right? So it's welcome. Kind of a mixed bag across all these predictions, looking at watch media, looking at the consumer, of course, looking at the industry and retail itself. Well, we're going to have to come back and look at these predictions a year from now and see how we did and see where the industry is. Should we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for listening. This is Open Work, a podcast from Collective Horology. You can find us online at collectivehorology.com. And to get in touch with your suggestions, feedback, or questions, just email podcast@collectivehorology.com.